Thank you so much to each of you for joining us here this afternoon. We're thrilled to welcome you to the second monthly Faith and Harm Reduction webinar series with today's conversation on mobilizing faith to end overdose and anti-Blackness. For those who are not familiar with Faith and Harm Reduction, we are a collaborative project of the National Harm Reduction Coalition and Judson Memorial Church here in New York City. As a national collective of faith and community leaders, we mobilize spirit, connection, and power in partnership with people who use drugs. We were born of the understanding that there was a call to build bridges between harm reduction and faith communities in order to develop leadership, strengthen harm reduction advocacy efforts, and build environments supportive of harm reduction policies and practices. As a collective, we have arrived at the following mission, which guides the spirit of our work. Faith and Harm Reduction co-creates a justice movement which connects people who use drugs, people who do sex work, in communities of faith through the development of harm reduction-centered spiritual resources, ritual support, and spiritual care. Today's webinar, like all of our efforts, is very much a work of love and was made possible by an incredible team of panelists, technical and ritual support, and our co-sponsors. Today, our conversation will be led by Reverend Ed Sanders, Senior Servant of Metropolitan Denominational Church in Nashville, Tennessee. Originally, we were going to be joined by Tracy Gardner, Vice President of Policy Advocacy at Legal Action in New York City. But unfortunately, a loved one of Tracy's and a powerful advocate for some of our most marginalized beloved died early this morning. So in honor of Rusty, we are dedicating this webinar and holding Tracy, her family, and Rusty's family in love. Reverend Dr. Arisha Bowers, Director of HEP Connect at Harm Reduction Coalition in Memphis, Tennessee, will join us in her place. And last but not least, Alexis Pluce, Mother Alexis, this is very much also my favorite title, and founder of Truth Farm in Binghamton, New York. Following the panelists, there will be a time for questions and answers, and we will wrap up our time together with a closing ritual. In addition to our panelists, the support of our co-sponsors is an invaluable gift. I would like to thank the Overdose and Drug Use Ministries of the United Church of Christ under the Reverend Michael Schuenmeyer and Reverend Tracy Blackman, in addition to the generous donor who made this ministry possible. I would like to thank Faith and Public Life, friend and colleague Blythe Barnow, their stellar comms team led by Michelle Neely, including Greg Williams and Austin Schuler, Legal Action Center, Truth Farm, and their incredible team of rainmakers, the Lighthouse Collective at the Harm Reduction Coalition, Metropolitan Interdenominational Church, and Reverend Sanders' co-captain, Cynthia Winfield, whom I know, in addition to providing support and leadership, is out pounding the pavement, doing vital census work throughout Tennessee day after day. So thank you, Cynthia, for your service. And of course, the biggest thank you is owed to Faith and Harm Reduction's National Leadership Collective, whose vision and shape all of our movement building. This webinar is very much a reflection of their spirit, their love, and their commitment to our collective belief that liberation is possible together. So thank you. And to all of you joining us in this movement here today, we welcome you. And with this, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Reverend Dr. Arisha Bowers, who will read Prophecy Poem written by Bright Black Broadcast number 3. We share this with you as a reminder that the institutions that harm us are not our only sources of power. We are resources for each other. We believe that our lives and our world can be different. May you all receive it and join us in transforming life on earth.
Black bodies disappearing into death. State-sanctioned chokeholds. It will not always be this way. The impossibility of breathing. It will not always be this way. I listen to my ancestors when they say, it will not always be this way. To steady my steps, I have to pray. It will not always be this way. It cannot always be this way. It will not always be this way. It will not always be this way. I continue to say, it will not always be this way. As I smile, remembering what's gone is for yesterday. Liberation is possible, perhaps not today. It will not always be this way. Hasten the change. No more lives should pay. It will not always be this way. Y'all must got me effed up. It will not always be this way. You must not know who taught me to pray. It will not always be this way. Trickster, teacher, chaos, play. It will not always be this way. I'm going to be here anyway. It will not always be this way. It will not always be this way. There is more than one way. Gather the children and tell them it will not always be this way. Remind each other that it will not always be this way. Name your babies. It will not always be this way. The ancestors promise it will not always be this way. Baptize in the name of it will not always be this way. We make joy because it will not always be this way. I was born to love and to play. It will not always be this way. We will dance into the black light of a brand new day. It will not always be this way.
Thank you so much, Dr. O. At this point, I'd like to welcome a beloved and powerful colleague, Natalia Gibbs. Natalia joined Harm Reduction Coalition in September of 2019 as our LGBTQ and harm reduction coordinator, where she is currently building the Lighthouse Learning Collective. The collective's mission is to build relationships between LGBTQ service providers, substance use providers, and community members to transform systems of care for people who use drugs. She hopes for this to become a space to hear community needs, inform resource development, increasing culturally responsive and affirmative care, as well as providing capacity building and technical assistance to collective members in organizations and in community. Thanks, Natalia.
Thank you, Erica. And so I think what we're gonna do before we jump into this panel is everybody's gonna have a chance to speak. I will go ahead and read one of the bios, and then whoever is speaking can go ahead and talk for a little bit. So our first panel member is Reverend Ed Sanders. They are a senior servant of Metropolitan Interdenominational Church in Nashville, Tennessee, whose mission is being inclusive of all and alienating to none. In 1984, the church began serving people with HIV/AIDS, and Sanders brings the unique perspective of faith and spirituality into the discussion of the global HIV/AIDS education, prevention, research, and treatment. He has presented at 9 international AIDS conferences and serves on many national boards, including the National Minority AIDS Council and the PEPFAR Scientific Advisory Board.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introduction. And I guess, especially on this occasion, I should make specific reference to the fact that I also serve on the Drug Policy Alliance Board as well. As a matter of fact, just at our last meeting, I found myself realizing that I might be the oldest continuously serving member on that board. I don't know if I want to own that much longer or not, but it is indeed a pleasure just to be asked to be a part of this particular conference, because I feel that this theme, this question that you're raising in terms of the whole question of faith and faith in harm reduction and the ways in which those things have a point of connection, that it's very important, I think, for us to lift up. Mainly because if indeed we think in terms of most of our faith institutions in relationship to the realities of life that are unfolding around us, this whole question of liberation ends up being and should be one that is synonymous. For indeed, in most of our faith traditions, we find ourselves realizing that a part of what we are called to do, a part of where we find ourselves posturing our energies, ends up being in responding to how it is that oppressive forces in one way or another are undermining, crippling, and rendering those who are in the world in which we live to positions of disadvantage. And especially when you realize that that position of disadvantage, as it's often seen and defined, is really one that is the byproduct of the ways in which the search for personal avenues to liberation can be identified. But I think right now, one of the things that's so important for us, if we're going to have this conversation in the times in which we're living, is it gets to be very important to deal with the points of intersection that exist between so much of what is compelling our attention, and at the same time, very often ends up being addressed in ways that would seemingly be defined by single issue kinds of movements and single issue kinds of politics, when indeed it's a part of a fabric that is much larger. So in that the fact, I always find myself using some kind of a theme or some kind of a caption for what I'm trying to do when I'm trying to speak to any audience. The theme I want to use for a few minutes today is the theme myths, lies, and misrepresentations of the truth. Myths, lies, and misrepresentations of the truth. I think that theme ends up being an important backdrop for our conversation, since we are right now physically in spaces and places within these United States of America. And so much of what represents the ideals that are advanced around us and suggested to us end up being so much the basis upon which some of the values and some of the vision and some of the aspirations are grounded. It gets to be really important to understand what that is. I want to just tell you a little thing about my experience with my daughter. She is now a grown woman. She teaches down at the University of Pennsylvania. But I remember once when she was sitting at the dinner table with her siblings, and I think, I'm sure that day all three of us happened to be at the table. And she was really early adolescent at that point. And then our table was a place where there were intense conversations every day around dinner, especially. But one of the things that we always were dealing with were issues that focused on the ways in which the contradictions and the ways in which the basis in which, the ways in which, you know, I guess bias and prejudice and bigotry and racism, and then as those conversations evolved over time, many of the other isms and phobias that we find ourselves addressing were a part of our conversation. But this one particular day, my daughter said in the midst of our conversation, she said, "Daddy, is everything about race?" And I remember pausing for a moment, because my first inclination was to say, yes, it is. But I decided that I probably should qualify it a little bit. And I said to her, just about everything. When you think about this whole question of liberation and the way in which it ends up having a point of interface with the whole question of harm reduction, and especially the whole business of substance use, I think we find ourselves having to say that because of the way in which there's kind of been a demonization of people who in one way or another accept and exercise their freedom to whether it be personal or whether it be sanctioned or unsanctioned in terms of legalistic or governmental terms, there's a way in which, in one way or another, we probably need to always stand on the side of a degree of advocacy in terms of support, for indeed it is a vehicle by which liberation ends up manifesting itself in life in the ordinary sense. Let me try to go further and just tell you why I want to use that theme, though, of myths, lies, and misrepresentations of the truth. I had an experience a few years ago. This is a few years ago, I guess. It's almost 50 years ago now, when I was a part of a think tank that's known as the Aspen Institute. I won't give you the whole story about how I happened to end up there, but the short story is there was a moment when they were trying to prepare for the bicentennial celebration, and they wanted to have a statement that they would make regarding the vision, or at least have the voice of the Institute included somewhere in the various documents that were being prepared for this particular occasion. And the theme that they had chosen to develop was the American Testament, kind of in the same spirit of faith folks who might, especially in religious circles, talk about, old, new, and the like. And there's a way in which what happened there, and there was an unbelievably gifted group of scholars and people who were in the judiciary, people who were international leaders, academic types, political types, business and corporate types were all there. And then there were just 2 or 3 of us who were pretty young and were nowhere near tied up in all of the minutiae that's a part of that reality. We found ourselves there and trying to contribute to the conversation. A couple of the people that were there, well, 3 people I'll reference to you very quickly. I remember our group was headed up on a daily basis by Bill Moyers, who has always had a sensitive ear to that which represents issues of faith and spirituality. And then there was the voice of the presence of Joseph Campbell, who many of us know in terms of his work was kind of the voice of trying to help us understand how myth ends up being a part of our everyday reality. And then there was Mortimer Adler. And I look at the voices, the faces on the screen. I think 1 or 2 of us might know who Mortimer Adler is, because the reason why many don't know who Mortimer Adler is nobody's had to look at an Encyclopedia Britannica in so long. But he's pretty much the person who was about the business of making an attempt to try to suggest the history of knowledge and the ways in which thinking was a byproduct of something that evolved over cultures and centuries and generations and all that. That's who was there, all right? And what we ended up with is this. The final document for the American Testament was 4 pieces. The first piece was the Declaration of Independence. The second piece was the preamble to the Constitution. The third was Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And the fourth, interestingly enough, was Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from the Birmingham jail. What I remember most about that experience was the challenge that was brought to bear in terms of how we could translate what was the language and what the words of these documents represented over against what the realities were at the time. And the reason why I use this theme of myths, lies, and misrepresentations of the truth is that so much of what ends up being what we think of as being the foundational pieces of literature that speak to this country's focus with regard to what is sometimes passed off as being an attempt at some degree of inclusion. But it doesn't take but half a second for you to realize that so much of the language that suggested oneness, wholeness, and unity was instantly undermined by the fact that there were people because of gender and people because of culture and people because of ethnicity that were already being excluded from being a part of the fabric. But what I found to be interesting over time is how it is that the myth ends up being something that very often is a widely held but false focus, a widely held belief but yet somehow probably false in the way in which it actually plays out. And then the idea of just an outright lie being an attempt to redefine reality. And in many instances, that ended up compromising even the thought process of those who were the scientists of the day. For indeed, you end up disqualifying the wholeness, fullness, and completeness of human beings on the basis of which you chose to put them into the fabric as commodity and something less than could be appreciated in terms of their humanness. And then there ends up being the question of how indeed there is a sense of at least the advancement of what we would call a truth. But then what we find is that that truth very often is misrepresented, and often misrepresented in terms of people of faith and spirituality. Now, all that together for me is just the foundation of what I want to suggest has to be a part of how we look at this question of where we are in terms of building effective responses to how it is that persons who use substances and persons who end up having life experiences that in one way or another are to some degree shaped by, are driven by, or at least incorporate, just leave it at that, this whole business of substance use. What we find is that when you think about the ideals, which we try to suggest as being at the heart, center, and core of who we are, and then look at the ways in which behavior that should be seen as something that is a part of life opportunity that should be at least open to decision making with regard to the individuals who are a part of the society. When you think of those things in relationship to each other, you begin to understand the breadth of the contradictions. I have to say to you that I always, when I use the word contradictions, especially in relationship to tough times, hard times, and difficult questions, I find myself always thinking about Howard Thurman, because Howard Thurman had one of the lines, probably my favorite quote from Howard Thurman, is the line that none of life's contradictions are final. So at the same time, I'm very clear and very quick and very certain about the way in which I want to point out the contradictions, because it is the backdrop as a society that perpetuates myths and perpetuates lies and perpetuates misrepresentations of the truth that puts us in the bind of having to struggle with how we deal with questions like liberation and how we deal with questions and the necessity of dealing with questions that represent anti-Blackness, anti-racism, you know, and you could go through a lot of the other isms and phobias in that regard also. But what I'm saying is that it all is built on top of a set of contradictions. And far too often, unfortunately, those contradictions end up being perpetuated by faith and spiritual leaders. We know that in terms of how it impacts political process. We know that in terms of the way in which it represents justice as relates to reproductive rights. We know that in relationship to the ways in which the avenues for opportunity in terms of the development that is very often in this country measured in material ways. We know it's true. So what we end up having to say is that to talk about, it's amazing how often people who are in the arena of dealing with substance use, somehow even that arena of work, as well as, you know, the ways in which people who are a part of other socially stigmatized life experiences of people that so many of us work with, one of the things we end up finding ourselves seeing is that there's a way in which it's the other, okay? It's not really it's the they, the them, and the those over against somehow being understood as the we, the our, and the us. And one of the things that I say very often about that is that very often it's just a matter of how you define and how you see who we are at any given moment in terms of the things that govern, the things that drive and promote behavior that for one side of the equation ends up being stigmatizing, for the other side of the equation ends up either being accepted or not dealt with forthrightly and honestly, mainly because of these ideas that are tied up in these myths and in these lies. So what I want to say is that it gets to be very important for us to talk about these issues in a way that allows us to have some truth basis from which to start. And I guess one of the things I want to conclude with, and is to say this, is that there are all kinds of ways in which belief systems manifest themselves in our lives. I tell people, though, that I believe that what we believe is by far in the realm of being the most powerful thing that we have. What we believe ends up being so fundamental and ends up being so central and so much a part of who we are that we have to try to be always at the point of keeping our finger on the pulse of the things that we have given ourselves to believe. There's a line that people use all the time that I must admit I am not at all a proponent of. I hope I don't offend anybody in this, but I happen to be a person who hates the line, "It is what it is," because usually that is a statement of surrender to sometimes things that the last thing we want is to claim it as somehow being that way and there's nothing we can do about it. I do think that as people of faith, we always have to have the sense of a possibility to change, the possibility of being vehicles and instruments of transformation, to being people who will declare a truth that talks about a possibility of harmony and unity and oneness and wholeness and all that language that we love to embrace. But at the same time, in many instances, because of the ways in which, especially with race, so much of what we deal with that's harmful has become institutionalized. It has become woven into the fabric in a way that makes it systemic. It does end up being a part of that which we know has come to be so central to our everyday lives that it's almost inescapable for us to get to the place where in one way or another, we are not caught up in it. So the thing I would also say, so everybody easily says, you know, we're dealing with a systemic problem, you know, we're dealing with a structural problem, you know, we're dealing with a, you know, what I say, systemic and structural. And then there's a way in which what I want to get to, though, is talk about how it ends up being not just systemic, but also an internalized problem that is so much a part. These contradictions that we have been fed and these lies and these myths that we find ourselves standing on in terms of how we have expectation of something better in our society, in many instances end up being at the heart of the problem. So the structural, the institutional, the systemic, but also I'm saying it's the internalized. And what we're working to do in harm reduction is to help people recognize that and turn it into one of their life callings to figure out how to give it a response that takes us into a realm, that takes us into an experience, that takes us into a way of life that does not leave us in places where we so easily overlook and discount and dismiss people who I think have to be included in the equation of inclusion if indeed we're going to be faithful to what we believe the truth is. When you look at those 4 documents I talked about earlier, it's clear that only the one that came from Martin Luther King Jr. is the one that challenged faith community leaders in a way that said, if indeed we are going to be who we say we are, then there's no way we can be a part of perpetuating, accepting, or allowing the madness that represents the harm that is being experienced by people every day is something that we don't talk about. It has to be what we give voice to the extent that we preach, we teach, and we, in any other way, promote. There's a way in which a part of that language has to be a language of liberation, and it has to be one that's a language of liberation for everybody in a way that represents a respect for their worth and a respect for their personhood that is not compromised by anything, especially something that ultimately is grounded in a lie to begin with. I must honestly say I haven't been watching the clock. So I think we had I don't hope that wasn't more than we had time for.
Not too much over, but thank you so much. That was beautiful. And I'm really excited to introduce our next panelist, who is a work colleague, Reverend Dr. Arisha Bowers, who holds a BFA, an MA, an MED, and a PhD in interdisciplinary studies, a graduate certificate in women and gender studies, and a certificate in complementary alternative medicine. Arisha has more than 15 years of experience in social services, nonprofit leadership, grants management, program design, and civic leadership. Arisha's life work is centered on an intentional merging of women's studies, education, interdisciplinary, and creativity, spirituality, healing, wellness, and movement. She uses scholarship and vocation to do healing work in communities of color and in reproductive health, women's issues, and communities of faith. Arisha, an ordained minister through the Universal Life Church, she combines spiritual focus with the therapeutic disciplines of mindfulness dancing in order to offer dynamic dancing mindfulness and other healing practices across the United States.
Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. And thank you, Reverend Sanders. Oh my gosh, I'm having a moment of being on this panel right now. So I have admired and esteemed Reverend Sanders for a number of years. So just wanted to name that. Please do excuse me for my camera being off, but I experienced Zoom difficulties this time of the day. And so I did not want to take a risk of my system shutting down in the middle of my words here. So I will not be before you long, but I would like to follow up Reverend Sanders' talk along the lines of examining our lexicon or looking at language. So what is a lexicon? It is the vocabulary of a person or a language or a body of work or a branch of knowledge. And for us, our branch of knowledge is harm reduction. So what does harm reduction even mean, right? our general understanding of harm reduction is that it's a set of principles and practices designed to lessen or lower negative consequences for people, right? That is what we say the definition broadly of harm reduction is. And so how do we exercise our understandings of some of the words that we use? And I wrote down things like, I'll talk to you today a little bit about movement, the word movement, the word liberation. So what is that? Liberation, the act of setting someone free from imprisonment, slavery, or oppression. It's a release. I'm gonna let that sit right there for a few minutes. And then lastly, movement. It's an act of changing physical location or a change or a development. So with us agreeing, I'm gonna use my sanctified imagination and assume that we're all agreeing that we have the same definition of those words and our application of those words are pretty much the same. And we are in unity around the way we see those words in our day-to-day walk with our participants and our colleagues and our community members. Then let us take a step back and see, how do we address anti-Blackness? With all those words and definitions in mind, how do we address anti-Blackness? What is that? It's being opposed to or being hostile towards Black people. Now, if we are going to truly set someone free, someone being Black folks, then how do we do that if we're unwilling most of the time to have those uncomfortable conversations about that hostility that we notice in our communities? Or if we are opposed to even acknowledging that it exists in a lot of cases. It makes it really difficult then, right, for us to truly liberate folks. And who are we trying to liberate? Not just Black folks, but folks who use drugs, folks who are marginalized in all types of ways, right? Where liberation doesn't just apply to one community, it applies to a lot of communities. It applies to a lot of identities. It applies to a lot of different kind of people. So how do we really go about applying harm reduction and liberation to liberate all these individuals, all these folks in a way that means movement or moving from one place to another? I just have a lot of questions for us today to consider as we're moving through this conversation. I want to bring us back to the words that we use every day to describe our work and who we are as people and who we are as leaders. How do we do these things? My mama once told me that two things can't occupy the same space. So I can't be about liberation for one group of people if I'm not about it for another group, right? I can't care about somebody's liberation if I don't care about their humanness, them receiving all of the justice and amenities that I want for myself. I gotta let them have them too, right? If we're really gonna move people from one place to another, if we're really gonna liberate and set free people, we have to inquire and examine, interrogate ourselves in those spaces where our whiteness or even our Blackness might be blocking us from doing true liberation work, true movement work. And one last word I want to put before us, because I know I've asked you a lot of questions. Now I want to get on y'all nerves. You know, I'm from Tennessee where we talk a long time to get to the point, and I'm not trying to do that today. I'm gonna move it along, but I want to give you one more word to consider, and that word is salve, S-A-L-V-E, which is defined as an ointment used to promote healing of the skin or as a protection. How are we being salved to people in our communities? How are we healing them, protecting them? And if we aren't personally protecting them, how are we facilitating that healing and that protection for them? Are we using our platforms to speak where in places where folks who are marginalized might not have a voice? Are we using the opportunities that we're given to bring those folks to the table, to bring them into the conversation where they hadn't been invited before? How do we do that? How do we create that salve that helps to heal us all, that helps to liberate us all, that helps to move us all, that is truly harm reduction? How do we do that? You don't have to answer right now, but I just want to put a few things on your mind, put a little stain on your membrane for today, and ask you to ask yourself, I use these words all the time, but how do I really do that in a way that is really moving the people that I'm there to serve, that I'm there to lead, that I'm there to minister to? The psalmist said, there's a balm in Gilead. Are you a balm? Are you a salve? Are you the salt in your communities? Those are my questions that I leave you with today. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to just talk for a minute.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. O. I'm definitely going to be sitting with those questions. And just to introduce our last panelist before we get into questions, and also feel free to drop any questions you have for our panelists in the chat so we can ask them later. But our last panelist is Alexis Playas, who is a licensed professional engineer with over 25 years of experience in design and construction industry. She's been a corporate trainer for over 20 years and was an adjunct professor for 9 years in the civil engineering program at SUNY Broome. She's also an artist, a writer, a public speaker, a community organizer, and volunteer. But her most important role that she's had in her life is being the mother of 3 sons. In 2014, she lost her oldest son, Jeff, to a heroin overdose, and as a result of that experience, founded Truth Farm, a nonprofit organization with a focus on raising awareness, reducing the stigma, educating and advocating to reduce the harms caused by substance use. The organization is deeply committed to social and racial justice issues as they move forward in addressing the current overdose epidemic, but with the goal of ultimately ending the war on drugs.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by the power of the previous speakers and humbled even to be in this space. So I'm struggling with that at the moment. And I kind of am mentally rewriting what I wanted to say because Reverend Sanders framed things in such a way that it kind of pushed me in that direction. So if it isn't perfect, hopefully it'll be okay. First of all, just to give a very brief history of my story. So yes, I'm the mother of 3 sons, and I lost my oldest son, Jeff, to a heroin overdose in August of 2014. And my youngest son currently is 24 years old. So all grown men at this point is what they like to tell me. And my oldest son, had the typical path of substance use and my gross misunderstanding of what his substance use disorder was like for him, and the direction that I and my family took. While I think that I was a bit empathetic to his substance use disorder, I, often took the hard, tough love approach, and I am living with a lot of regrets for that. And unfortunately, those regrets will last a lifetime at this point. And I'm really thankful that my loss led me to wanting to do something in regards to saving other people, if not from loss, then from regrets. And a lot of times that's a difficult thing to express because ultimately we are not going to we can't pick and choose, and we can't solve the problem for everyone. And ultimately there are going to be people who lose loved ones no matter what your efforts are. But maybe we can reduce some of the regrets that happen along the way. And so that is a lot of the work that I do now and with Truth Farm. So one of the things that I have learned since starting Truth Farm is that parents who've lost a loved one tend to have what I think we miss when we talk about the 7 stages of grief. I think that we miss that if you lose a child, there's an 8th stage of grief. And I like to call it somebody's gonna pay. And as I have explored grief journeys with other parents, I've been a little stunned by the level of anger and this desire to make someone pay. But what I have come to learn and realize is that, what we need to do is educate and direct that anger in the right place. And so what I try to do is help parents recognize there are little things along the way that may have led to our child's death that could have been different. And there are places that we can place some anger and be frustrated and, recognize that there are harms that have been done. But ultimately, we need to direct that anger to the place that's going to solve the most problems, even if it wasn't something that maybe we don't think we can directly relate to it, but we have to find the way to look at the bigger picture. And one of the things that Reverend Sanders was talking about it's funny because it connects so closely to my belief system and the things that we talk about at Truth Farm. When he talked about, you know, our system is founded on racism. It's funny because one of the protests I attended, I put that on one of my signs, because as an engineer, when I started the organization Truth Farm, the thing that I kept saying is, I don't know what I want to do yet, but as an engineer, we are wired to fix things. But we don't want to fix the same problem over and over again. We want to get to the root of the problem. And so that has been my journey at Truth Farm, is trying to understand where we need to go to get to the root of the problem. And as an engineer, we know everything starts with the foundation. And if the foundation is faulty, we can keep fixing the structure at the top, but nothing is going to be solved until that foundation is fixed. And unfortunately, you know, and again, his words were so powerful and were so, they're so framed so right for some of the things that I wanted to say. But if we don't get to fixing that foundation, we're not going to solve any of the problems. And as he said, maybe it's not all about race, but it's almost all about race. And we know that this drug war is founded on racism. And so I believe there are so many things that we can do to save lives. There's so many little steps that we can do, and there's so many ways that we as harm reductionists can reduce harm. But we cannot save all the lives, and we cannot end the drug war unless we are committed to and working on ending racism. And that is, at least at this moment of time in my life and my journey, what I have settled on is the foundational problem, why we employ all of these little fixes, and we work on treatment, and we try to make it more accessible, and we try to employ harm reduction strategies, and we try to develop compassion, and we educate people. We do all of these other things, and I think that they're helping, and I think they're solving problems, and I think they're, you know, reducing regrets. But until we really work on racism, and until we can solve that problem, we cannot end the war on drugs, and we will continue to lose human lives. And I'm convinced of that. And just a couple other things that I wanted to mention. You know, it's not lost on me that I'm white. And there are so many parents out there in this overdose epidemic who are white and are experiencing that 8th stage of grief of trying to find someone who's got to pay. And I think that it is our job to start to direct them in this way. And it's a hard thing to do. We get a lot of pushback at our organization when we do anti-racism work and we fight racism. The battles are hard and they're painful, but it is work that is necessary, and I think really important. And we who have lost a child, you know, we have the ultimate perspective of what the most painful loss that you can experience in life feels like. We have had the ultimate loss. And so this is a perspective that I think a lot of times people ignore. I think parents a lot of times are dismissed, even in the harm reduction work and in the harm reduction world. I think mothers are dismissed quite a lot. And maybe part of it is because of that 8th stage of grief and having their anger misdirected and heading in the wrong way, the wrong path. But I think that we still need to harness that power of that ultimate loss perspective of family members who have lost someone so dear to them, and then let them help guide others in a direction that will produce less regrets in the future, and maybe help end racism, even if, I think it's our job, even if you're as white as me, I think it's absolutely our job to help in every way that we possibly can. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about, just because Reverend Sanders, again, I don't know what it was about he connected to me on a level that was fascinating, but he was talking about that conversation he had with his daughter. And I was thinking about, I have this, real frustration with my two living sons of, well, let me back up. All three of my white sons have had interfaces with law enforcement. Two of them have been incarcerated, and one, he wasn't incarcerated, but I'm convinced it's because he was white. And I get so frustrated with my own sons, because when we talk about race and racism, they'll say, well, I was impacted too. I was arrested. I wasn't incarcerated. And the other night, I spent some time walking through my sons' lives and realizing, and I'm sorry, it'll make me choke up again, but realizing, like, there's a chance that none of my sons would be alive if they were Black, because they were prone to this interaction with law enforcement, and they were so strong-willed and had such big spirits, and they were so rebellious, that there's a chance that all three of my sons would not be alive at this point, or would all be incarcerated at this point if they were not white. And I'm sorry as a mother that we as white folks don't know that we should have been having those conversations at the kitchen table with our kids, just like Reverend Sanders was having with his daughter. That we could have been having those conversations as they were growing up about the difference that they would experience life as a white person versus Black, and how their privilege was, each time my sons interfaced with law enforcement, I wish I had known to teach them that it was their privilege that bought them, the chance to not spend their life in prison, or the chance to, maybe they were searched by police, but they weren't abused physically by police. Their experience was completely different. And I appreciate hearing about Reverend Sanders' conversation with his daughter. And I would implore and encourage, all white families at this point to start having those same exact race conversations at the kitchen table, that our friends of color are forced to have, because they can't live without an awareness of their color, and their children can't grow up in this world without an awareness of their color. And I think that white families need to start doing the exact same thing, so that we can start to turn things around. And then I'll just close with the fact that, I say all the time, and it's difficult mainly for white folks to understand, but I say all the time, my son was white, but he died of racism. He died from racism because without the war on drugs, my son wouldn't be dead, and there wouldn't be a war on drugs without racism. And so I'm passionate about this cause, and passionate that we save lives from substance use disorder, but we're not going to do it ultimately until we face racism head on. And I believe we're at a moment in time when we can actually do that as a nation. And again, I thank you so much for allowing me the time to speak in this place with these incredible folks. And thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Erica and Sarah, for bringing this group of folks together. And kind of just to jump into some of these questions, feel free, anybody, to answer whichever question you'd like. And again, anybody who is listening, if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. you know, and Alexis, you kind of touched on this a bit towards the end. And I think it's really important, you know, if we're going to start thinking about how we move people and how we help people, you know, bring people to understand kind of where we're coming from, it's really important to know where they are. And so I guess I wanted to hear from each of you, you know, how are communities of faith or your own communities thinking or talking about overdose and racial justice? And if they're not talking about it, why not?
Natalia, this is Arisha. I'll say that in my community, I find that a lot of communities of faith or faith leaders and just people of faith in general still are holding on to a lot of the respectability politics around drug use, and this mentality that, you know, well, overdose is just it's a consequence for your choices. You know, it's a very punitive narrative that they've latched onto, and are not willing to embrace you know, harm reduction as a sound practice set of practices that includes, you know, life-saving information and life-saving strategies. They just are, in my opinion, not everybody, I want to be clear, but some people feel like, you know, this is just a consequence of your poor choices, and they have just latched on to that and refused to, you know, move from that place. And I feel like one way to kind of change that is, you know, those who have the opportunity to, you know, myself and others who have the opportunity to hold just very frank and candid conversations with individuals about why harm reduction is important, why it's important for us to meet people where they are and connect those things in a way that, in language that people understand, right? So the same scriptures that people use to oppress people, we got to spin those things on their ear. We have to talk in words and language that people use so that they can make the connections for themselves. We spend a lot of time on the defensive, but if we can figure out how to tailor the message and use language that people do resonate with to say the same thing, just a different way, it may, you know, it may cause people to think differently or have, I won't say a change of heart, but possibly a change of heart. I mean, God changes our heart, but you know, but it opened them up to more conversations. That's just one way, one strategy that I try to use. But you know, I mean, it's not going to work for everybody, but it is a way. Sometimes I have to just tailor my language, or use that same scripture, or use something from biblical text that they understand, that it resonates with them, to make the same points. And I see a lot of times that people are like, oh, I never thought about it that way, or I never interpreted that like that. And it at least opens them up to more conversations. Still not necessarily ready to do a needle exchange at the church, but willing to have more conversations about ways to be more inviting and more inclusive and more helpful, just in general, more helpful and hospitable to people.
Yes, there are a couple of things, and Dr. O, the last point you just made me think of how important it is to make sure that our strategies in response to, you know, this horror that's being visited upon us because of our Blackness, as relates to association with substance use. One of the things that gets to be important, and I think you were, you know, right on it in terms of how we have to become the voices that take this language, which in many instances we're talking about language of the basic text of our faith traditions, and rethink it, reframe it, and speak to it in ways that allow us to be able to not perpetuate anything that resembles the fear-driven response. That's one of the things we tried to do early on with needle exchange at Metropolitan. You know, we did syringe exchange for a number of years when it had to be an underground effort. But what I found to be interesting is over time, as people became aware of syringe exchange, the impetus that seemingly was driving so much of what was advancing what I would call the cause at that moment was framed in negative kinds of terms. An example for you in my life in that regard, and Dr. O, I guess you probably might know this, but you know, I grew up right there on the streets of Memphis, Tennessee, in Orange Mound, all right? I always laugh when I say that because my street creds went up significantly with my kids when they found out I grew up in Orange Mound. But one of the things I remember about my mother is because I was, you know, pretty outspoken and pretty aggressive, as well as being a fairly, you know, large person in stature. I think my mother spent a lot of time tempering who I was. I think I had a lot of fire. My mother, I think, was trying to channel that fire in a way that would not translate into me being a part of what's referenced in that song, Strange Fruit, and the way in which I, you know, hear and see the stories that are part of what has happened in the revelations that have come with the new lynching memorial, the museum that exists down in Montgomery. Just realizing how many young Black people, male and female, were hung and were lynched. But I'm trying to speak to this whole question of how we learn to frame our response, which creates some caution, which creates some, you know, position of understanding in our young folks' minds, but not one that's totally grounded in something that's driven by fear. I always say that I think I had, you know, the fire in my belly, if that language works for anybody, but there's a way in which I'm always concerned that the fire is not a consuming, destructive fire, but rather ends up being an energizing and progressive fire. So when I'm thinking about and talking, and it sounds to me like, I mean, Alexis, you're in the perfect position with the people that you're talking to a lot. It's trying to help people understand how to channel that energy. I mean, I'll give you just one little example, which to this day stands out in my mind, is that when I was just barely 8 years old, 7 to 8 years old, I remember being forbidden to whistle. Can you imagine being in a world where you would tell a child you cannot whistle? But the cannot whistle mandate in our community and in my home even was the byproduct of the murder, lynching of Emmett Till. And the suggestion that somehow his life was snuffed out because he was whistling. And this is what I meant earlier when I was saying to you about, you know, I talked about, you know, the structural, the systemic, you know, and the institutional racism, but this internalized racism. I mean, there are scars in the depths of the personality of so many of us. This new way of talking about, was it adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and the way in which there's so many things that happen to young people that have a crippling effect. So you might think of the drugs as being a crippling effect, but what I'm saying is that many of the strategies that are brought to bear in terms of the way in which we respond to these issues is probably as harmful or more harmful. It's harmful if it snuffs out creativity in a way. It's harmful in a way if it somehow oppresses, you know, the ways in which people can creatively, you know, use the energies that are their God-given gifts. So when we talk about this, I think it gets to be important to make sure, and this goes over to Dr. O, we have to make sure that we're using liberation language, because it's so easy to fall into the trap in our defensive posture that we end up creating a different kind of scar. But it does start with getting to where you have to deal with the truth. That experience in South Africa around truth and reconciliation. I love the way people who are well educated and properly aware of what's going on in the world like to talk about what came out of that experience with Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela and how they were able to bring a nation together. Well, the fact is, it's not as well put together as we think it is sometimes. You travel in South Africa, you realize it's not the kind of healing that you would like to see in a total sense. But what I find to be the issue is they had exactly the right idea, truth and reconciliation, right? And what we're doing now in terms of some of our drug laws end up being very well put in terms of the truth of what we might need to be doing to make a difference. But what I've discovered is a lot of people who can find how to wrap their minds intellectually around the concept of truth and reconciliation, they love to talk about reconciliation, but they do not like to deal with the truth. And the truth ends up being the foundation that allows you to then take that step to reconciliation. Because there is a healing that has to happen in our communities and in this country and in this world. But it doesn't end up working if you're simply denying, dismissing, and avoiding what the real situation is.
The only thing that I will add to this is, when Dr. O talked about the framing of the conversations and how sometimes we have to change how we're speaking depending on who we're speaking to. And I think that's correct. And I also sometimes think of it as I have to take a very long journey with some folks to get to where I want them to be. So sometimes I can't have the most direct conversation, but what I can do is talk about, and it's funny because I have now in our overdose reversal training slide, so the slide where we teach people how to use Narcan, I start every single one of those presentations out with a slide that shows the overdose rate in the United States. We have the highest overdose rate per capita in the world. And I show that compared to the rest of the countries, and Portugal has the lowest overdose rate in the world. And I put that slide up. This is an overdose reversal training, but I figure, hey, I've got an audience. So every time I have an audience, I'm going to slip a little messaging in there. So I put the slide up and I say, look at that, US is #1. We have the highest overdose rate in the world. Did you know that we also have the highest incarceration rate? And those two things go hand in hand. And it's the drug war that's killing folks, people. And then we move into the overdose reversal training. And so now maybe I haven't taken them directly on the path to racism is the root of all problems, but I have introduced them to the concept of the drug war is killing our children. And, I try, so like I said, sometimes it's a long path or a long journey to get folks where we need them to be. But every single time we have the opportunity to get some messaging in there that guides them to understanding what is happening really and why folks are dying, I think that that's our job. And those are some of the tactics that we use at Truth Farm to start to bring folks around to understand these concepts.
Wow, thank you everybody for those kind of powerful interconnecting answers. I think that kind of leads, I want to take it back a little bit to, this panel is about harm reduction and liberation, and also about anti-Blackness, which kind of takes us a little bit, beyond just race, but looking very specifically about people being against both Black people, but things associated with Blackness and with being Black. And so when we're thinking about harm reduction, when we're thinking about abolition, when we're thinking about the war on drugs, there are so many things that are important to fulfilling our promises to try to bring folks to, you know, health, wholeness, and freedom, and especially Black people, and especially Black people who use drugs. So if we're thinking about that, you know, how are harm reduction and abolition and liberation, you know, how are those the tools or the means by which we get to this health and wholeness and freedom for all people?
I guess the one thing I would say to your comment, and thank you for bringing us back to the make sure we spoke specifically to this anti-Blackness, and I would also say the anti-racism point, which is out there in the streets every day these days. But I would say this one thing, and that is the way I hear that word spoken, using the prefix anti, to me, it sounds like a mandate for activism. It's like, you know, if I am anti something, it's, and we've got a lot of people these days who are reading all the right books on racism, and a lot of people who theoretically and philosophically and intellectually, but there's a way in which it has to become a part of the energy of your life. It has to become a part of something that is, you know, a burning in your heart. It has to be something that is not satisfied by saying, I understand. You know, it's so much bigger in my mind than that. So it's an opportunity around which movement gets built. I remember one of my early opportunities to speak at a harm reduction coalition meeting was a theme that somehow was on my heart then, to talk about building a movement, what the difference between, you know, building a movement and what was sometimes just a matter of addressing an issue. A movement has an energy. A movement has a spirit. I mean, a movement has that level of impact to it. Yeah.
Hi, this is Arisha speaking. I think that my Reverend Sanders covered so much there. I think the thing that I could add is the healers need healing. Many of us who are leading this kind of work, who are leading those movements, who are stepping out front protesting, who are, you know, raising up new leaders, also need to be mindful of our needs to be healed, to be poured into, to be ministered to, so that we, you know, we can wash away those negative vibes, if so to speak, and be able to, you know, to be recharged, reset. And I feel like it's important for us to like guard our mental health, to guard our physical health, and make sure that we're surrounding ourselves with people who are positive, who are light to us, that we are continuing to educate ourselves so we have new knowledge, improved strategies, but things that, you know, are not replicating harmful practices, because it's so easy to get swept up in the anti mindset from a certain vantage point. So I would say for me, let us all continue to work together to explore healing and self-care, and how we continue to like sustain ourselves through those methods, which will be different for everybody, but how do we do that, and how do we teach other people to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm. Yes.
And I don't know, Alexis, if you wanted to jump in. If not, that's okay.
I don't think so. I think I'm gonna let that one go. It was perfect.
So I guess we're coming towards the end, so I kind of wanted to maybe wrap up with this kind of longer question. I know that we heard a little bit about truth and reconciliation and how important the truth part is, and whenever I think about that, I think about trust, and how so much trust is broken, and how much reconciliation isn't just about, you know, moving forward, but also all of the repair work that goes into building reconciliation. But also thinking about anti-Blackness and the role of white people, but also of people who are non-Black people of color, or people who are lighter-skinned people of color, and what their roles are in this kind of rebuilding of trust and reconciliation work as we start to address the racist war on drugs. So maybe just kind of to hear from everybody about what that work looks like, and what, you know, what are people's roles?
Is it okay? I'll go if it's okay.
Yes.
I mean, so I, you know, as a white person, leading an organization and wanting to do anti-racism work, a lot of times I think my job is to get out of the way and to make sure that I'm elevating the voices who have the personal experience and the lived experience, and doing whatever I can to empower their work and, you know, work alongside them and push them up as much as I can. So in our area, like our organization is primarily white folks like that, that's who has gravitated towards our organization. But we are very, we are committed as an organization to do anti-racism work and to support it, but we don't think that we should be the leaders in that work because that's not appropriate. And so we connect with Black-led organizations and serve alongside them, elevate their voices, support their work in any way that we can, build coalitions, financial support, emotional support. As Dr. O said, you know, try to, you know, fill them back up with wellness when they're getting tired. step in when they ask us to step in. And that's, you know, that's a lot of times that's the work that we need to do, is to not lead the work. And then the work that we do, I view the way that we conduct our work to just be important, that we are not adding harm and not adding to anti-Blackness. We take a very strong approach in the language that we use. We have a language policy for our organization, and we teach folks about better language to use. We don't talk about dealers. We don't talk about a black market. Like, we eliminate all of those words, and we talk about how harmful they are and how they contribute to racism. Even when a person may not, you know, think or intend to be racist, when those words come out of their mouth, there's images that strike in people's minds. And so if we abandon those words, we're starting to tear down that image that people hold on to. So, you know, I feel like the education that Truth Farm does and the awareness that we raise, our work is rooted in making sure that we don't add to anti-Blackness, and that we are anti-racist in the way that we're directing people's energies and attentions and solving these problems, and to teach harm reduction work. But then when we talk about the movement, I think our job is to elevate Black voices, Black leaders, Black women, and push their work forward.
pop out there and go because I think Reverend Sanders should be the last voice we hear on this question. And I feel like the audience will agree with me.
No.
So you asked the question about, you mentioned about reconciliation and trust. But I want to take a step back with my answer and say, like, acknowledgement is one of the things that I feel like, you know, white folks, black folks, right? Folks, period. Acknowledgement of what are the true feelings that are being felt has to happen. Anger, I'm learning here, anger is just a symptom. What's underneath anger usually is some form of hurt or some form of fear. And so once we put our finger on what those feelings are, what's driving the anger, what's underneath it, and acknowledge it, then we might be able to move of course, in a trauma-informed way, we may be able to move towards building trust and eventually getting to reconciliation. But I find that we want to put these blinders on and not be honest about, I'm pissed and it's legitimate for me to be pissed. And this is the reason why. This is what's under the fact that I'm pissed. Mm-hmm. We got to be willing as a community, as a society. You know, you can't just ask people to get over things. They have to be validated. People have to have their feelings validated and acknowledged. And I feel like a willingness to do that on both sides, because white folks have trauma that is a result of racism too. You know, but we don't want to acknowledge that, right? And we don't want to acknowledge that these things exist. And so we have to be truthful with ourselves. We have to be truthful with each other and be willing to keep coming back to the conversation, even though it hurts, even though it feels icky, even though I don't want to hear it sometimes, even though people are tired of hearing it. We still have to keep coming back because that acknowledgement and validation has to happen in order for us to begin to build trust and eventually reconcile all of these differences. The first step is acknowledgement. And
yes.
Stop talking.
Yes. Dr. O, I want you to know. And also, let me just tell you this. So I'll be wonderfully transparent with you, Alexis, and with Dr. O. You know, people ask me all the time because they know I'm moving around a lot, but I feel compelled every week to have a fresh word to share with our congregation. So they always ask me, when do you spend time working on your sermons? And I tell people I'm working on my sermons all the time, including moments like this. So I want you to know that you, Alexis, and you, Dr. O, will be included in Sunday's sermon. As a matter of fact, I think I might have even found a title. I didn't know what I was going to call it until I heard you. But I'm going to do Everything Starts with a Foundation. If any of you are lectionary preachers and readers, this is the week when the scripture says, upon this rock I'll build my church thing. I think that everything starts with a foundation. So thank you both in that regard. And as we say in the preaching world, this Sunday I will say that it came from the two of you. The week after, it'll be somebody I know. And the week after that, it'll just be mine. So anyway, we'll go with that. But let me share this with you. This is just in relationship to that last question with regard to trust. I want to make reference to a guy that some of you may know and don't know, but his name is Reuben Warren. One of the things that happened in the late 20th century, when the apology was offered by President Clinton at Tuskegee for the atrocity that had occurred there, which was one of the more severe breaches of trust in the history of the Black community, and in ways that still just carries an ugly scar. I saw where Dr. Warren, when challenged about this whole thing with regard to trust and the fact of people not trusting, he's the first person I ever heard say that the issue, and this is important, I think, especially in terms of the world that you have the opportunity to work in all the time, you know, Alexis, and that is he said that the real issue is to not worry about getting Black people to where they trust white people. It's really about the business of getting white people to where they are trustworthy. Now that's an interesting way, to put it. But trustworthiness is probably sometimes best reflected in the way in which you do accept the banner of carrying the message and the voice. The example I always use to get beyond it just being Black and white, I'll give you an example in terms of the LGBTQIA community, okay, community. And that is this. I tell people all the time, racism and racist behavior will diminish significantly when the issue is addressed aggressively, forthrightly, and without, any apology by white people talking to white people. Because when I'm in the room, people are on their best behavior. They think about being politically correct. And, I'm there to ring the bell of a reminder. But it has to come to the point. And the way I learned this most effectively is around the whole issue of homophobia. It's amazing how often people will be in a room and will hear a homophobic statement, or will hear someone speaking in misogynistic kinds of language and words and all that. But the issue ends up being when you address the issue because it's something wrong and something that needs to be addressed. And it best happens when you can be the straight person in the room who says, that's not tolerable, that's not acceptable, that's not something that we, just because it is the case that there is a level of candor, okay? And there is a level of openness in conversation sometimes when it is a room full of whites or a room full of Blacks. But the consciousness of your concern, it's, to me, Alexis, in your comments today, the point that I will carry with me and probably, talk about is that, that none of your sons might be alive today if they were Black. That's an awareness that is, that's a powerful punch, to be able to say that to your sons, that none of my sons would probably be alive today. Because like you said, they're strong kids, they're aggressive kids, they've got kids, they're with passion, and that's what gets a Black kid killed.
Right.
So I say to you, that we have to be the ones. I know I've been in that position where I've heard some people make their jokes. You're in the barbershop, somebody makes one of those homophobic jokes. You just have to stand up and stare it down and say something in that moment. And I think the same thing is true for white people. And let me tell you, there's a reverse to that too, and the Black folks. Even though sometimes I do feel myself feeling that, somebody needs to pay. I like the way you said that. Yeah. But anyway, I've said enough. But I appreciate you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for those answers. I think that I have a lot to sit with, and hopefully everybody else here does as well. I know we're a little bit over time, so I just want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. We hope that you will join us for the service of lament and resistance for lives lost to overdose and anti-Blackness tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern, and for the Preach In and Teach In on Saturday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And just as we close, we'd like to leave you with these words by Lucille Clifton. Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman, what did I see to be except myself? I made it up, here on this bridge between starshine and clay, my one hand holding tight, my other hand. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed.